Okay, today we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution because this is something that happens in the timeline of our class in the 1800s, but also something that is probably one of the biggest changes in human lifestyle that we've seen in the past 10,000 years or so. So this will have a gigantic effect on the daily lives of average people and also the power base that different countries will use and develop. The Industrial Revolution largely starts off in Europe and gets replicated in other European societies like the United States. And a lot of the rest of the world will see the amount of political, military, and economic power that the countries who industrialized build up fairly quickly by the late 1800s and then start trying to conquer much of the rest of the world. And those other countries around the rest of the world will start to want to industrialize themselves in order to catch up to the production of that wealth and power in order to at least defend themselves, if not to actively also get involved in some type of imperialism. So we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution as kind of shifting the economic and social realities that people are faced with, and the big changes that really revolutionize society in a lot of different ways. So first we're going to talk about what life was like and what work was like before the Industrial Revolution, and then the changes that the Industrial Revolution wrought over the 1800s. And then we'll end with Karl Marx's big reaction to industrial society, his complaints about it, and his proposals for solutions to those problems. All right, so we'll start off talking about just kind of what labor and daily life looked like before the Industrial Revolution. In the 1700s, humans still lived basically in ancient societies. The vast majority of people, of workers throughout the whole world, were farmers who grew food for their own survival, or they worked for landowners to grow the food on the landowners' plots of land, and basically the landowners kind of paid them in food so they could survive, and it took the extra food and sold it at market for profit. And this is an economic system that's been going on for thousands of years, ever since humans first started building kind of settlements and farming, agriculture. We call it the agricultural revolution. So this has been going on by the 1700s for 6, 7, 8,000 years, and depending on exactly which civilization you're talking about. And it was largely unchanged. There were some technological developments and advances in farming, but it was largely still the same thing. Another kind of general thing about this, the average farmers, all they did was really work the fields. Most of them would not be literate because they didn't really have time to learn to read and write. If you ever tried to go grow some food in your backyard or something, it's a lot of work just to grow a little bit of food. So you imagine working a field like what you see here in the picture of acreage is kind of work day and night, or at least day, throughout the entire year. And most of these peasant farmers, especially the ones who were merely paid in food, they weren't even paid money. They couldn't afford to buy books or hire teachers for their kids or anything like that. And public schools just did not exist as we think of them today. So the farmers generally, farming family, if you were born into a farming family, you would grow up helping your parents on the farm as best you could as a little kid. And as you grew kind of bigger and stronger into adulthood, you would take on more responsibilities, and then as your parents age, you might kind of take over their position on the farm. And it just went like that generation after generation for hundreds and even thousands of years. So another big thing about kind of ancient civilization, ancient societies in these agricultural societies, is that goods themselves, like tables or chairs or paper, pens, even clothes, just what we see as just the basic goods that humans use for survival, were all handcrafted. They were made by hand by professional craftsmen who had to study and prove themselves experts in carpentry or woodworking or glass making or whatever trade they're pursuing. And these craftsmen made things by hand, and making something like a table or a pair of glasses or any just handheld tools that farmers could use. This was seen as specialized labor. And the labor was so long and intensive to make something like that, it could take days for a craftsman, what you often see called artisans in textbooks and documentaries. Could take them several days to make just one tool or one pair of glasses, depending on the exact kind of tool that you're talking about. So these goods were also very expensive because you had to pay the craftsman basically for several days of labor to make the thing. And if you're talking about something like a book, one book had to be hand copied page by page, and any of the artistry or pictures that you see in the book had to be hand drawn over and over again, depending on how long the book is. If it's 20 pages or 100 pages, a book could take weeks for a craftsman to make. So even books were extremely expensive. So the average peasant farmer out there who might not even be paid in money doesn't have enough money to buy a book or anything like that to learn to read and write. So all the kind of goods that society depended on were very expensive, and a lot of them were seen as luxury goods. So the average population might own a couple pairs of clothes, a couple sets of clothes, and might own maybe a table that's been passed down in their family from generation to generation. But generally, a peasant farming family would not own much at all. They would own the basic necessities. And even wealthier families, like landowners, who might have a little extra cash from selling their excess food for profit at market, they wouldn't have extremely luxurious lifestyles usually. They might have a nice dining room with some silverware for eating and several sets of clothes or something like that, but they did not live a luxurious lifestyle as we think of it today. So a lot of these goods are extremely expensive, and just because they take so long to make. And the big trick with the Industrial Revolution is that it will change the creation of these implements that the artisans make, that take so long because they have to be handcrafted. And an artisan can only work so many hours a day before they get tired. Their muscles get tired and they have to eat and rest. The big trick of the Industrial Revolution is to take largely the human muscle labor out of the equation as much as possible and replace it with machines. So the Industrial Revolution wants to create some kind of machine that can run usually faster and with more power than human or animal muscle can usually create. And a machine that can run faster and more reliably, and also can be run day and night until it breaks down. So machines that get invented early on in the late 1700s and early 1800s, their intent is usually to merely make a machine that will replace the human and animal muscle power required to make something. So that the human interaction in production is really just tending to the machine, watching it, running the machine, and fixing it when it breaks down. And they quickly realize within a few decades that if you make one machine to do this and it's profitable, you can make several machines to do this and get even more profit. So investors will try to make several machines very much the same and then house them under one roof that they'll call a factory, so that they can bring workers to the machines in large numbers and just run the machines day and night with different workforces running different shifts. So you'll have large factories that'll basically just put a roof and walls around enclosures, groups of machines, and bring workers in shifts, 12, 14-hour shifts to run the machines. And as factories get built in similar areas, you basically get these things called factory towns, where a factory will pop up in a town and becomes profitable, and then a factory that wants to make some other good also kind of pops up in the town, and you're going to get these large populations that will move to the town just to do factory work. So this is a painting of very idealized factory life, where you see the factories in the background that kind of dominate the landscape, but the workers kind of on their off time are hanging out in the courtyard or out in the town square or something. And it's very idealized because, number one, they have time to kind of hang out and just enjoy life. Number two, the workers are not very dirty, which we know is not very true of factory work back then. Factory work was dirty and dangerous. And also, if you look at the sky in the background, it's fairly clear. I mean, you can see the sky, which after a few decades, some of these factory towns start putting out so much coal smoke that it'll blot out the sky. So the sky will be black sometimes in the middle of the afternoon. So that's a very idealized version of what factory life could be. Here's a map of where industrialization really gets going by, I think it's the year 1850, if I remember correctly. And it's basically showing you the percentage of the population that lives in cities and the amount of kind of where the factory towns are. And you can see that the darker colors down to purple is the highest density of population and the highest density of factories. So you see factories and population overwhelmingly are in Britain. So that's really where the Industrial Revolution just kind of kick-started in the late 1700s, and by the mid-1800s, Britain is the industrial powerhouse, and you'll see, as you can see on this map, the Industrial Revolution will spread to northern France, parts of what is today Germany, and then spread a little bit further east from there. And the United States will also get going with industrialization largely. It starts in the early to mid 1800s, but really kicks into high gear after the U.S. Civil War ended in 1865. So the early machines were based on water. Water was the power. So the early factories were usually located next to rivers, because the company would basically build a water wheel and stick it in the river, so that when the river ran through, it would turn the giant wheel, and that would be the power for the machines. So the machines were hooked up to the wheel in one way or another, and that's how the machines would run. The problem with that is that sometimes the rivers don't flow as heavily as other times of the year, so the energy source was fairly unreliable. It could go really fast one day, when a lot of water is running through the river, and maybe a couple months later it slows down quite a lot as the river water kind of slows to a trickle. So the big invention to try to solve that problem for the factory owners was called the steam engine, which is developed in the 1770s in its earliest form. And the steam engine is a big kind of leap forward in the technology, because the theory is, instead of hooking a wheel up to water, what they want to do is bring the wheel inside the factory and hook it up to a steam engine, basically, so that you can kind of funnel steam going up, melted water creating steam just like you do on your stove to cook food. You can direct this steam up to a kind of apex. You can funnel it up to a certain point, and you can push the steam up through a funnel so that the steam will be a very consistent and powerful source coming out of the funnel, and as it comes out, it will turn the wheel and basically run the machines. The big setback for the steam engine is that, number one, you need a lot of water to melt. And a lot of these factories are still kind of next to rivers, so that wasn't so much of a problem. But the bigger problem was you need a lot of heat and consistent, constant heat to keep that water hot, to evaporate it, to create the steam to run the machines. So what do you use to heat that water? Well, the eventual solution that started in Britain is coal. So Britain had huge coal deposits throughout its country, and the companies started going off and digging that coal out of the ground, because coal burns very hot and very consistently, and it's very useful for building that kind of heat to melt the water to get the steam. So we see, especially after the steam engines are kind of refined by the mid 1800s, the production of coal just skyrockets. Because these industrial owners want that consistent, very high levels of heat. And as you get more consistent steam, that creates more power, then machines, basically the technology starts to feed on itself. Inventors start creating machines that will go even faster and try to last longer under this new, heavier, and more consistent energy source. And the biggest kind of examples and symbols of the Industrial Revolution are really railroads and locomotives. Locomotive is really exactly what it sounds like. It's motion that is created locally. It doesn't require a horse at the end to pull with muscle or anything like that to make the train move. So the locomotive is at first invented really to carry coal from the coal mines on little cars on railroads and bring them to the factory site so the coal could be burned. But inventors and investors quickly realized that if you can move something as heavy as coal, that means you can also probably move a lot of other goods out of the factories and bring those finished products to markets all over the world, or at least all over your own country. So locomotives begin and railroads begin being used to move goods and also people from one part of a country or one locality to another. And because the trains can move so much faster and more consistently than anyone's ever seen before, they also become the kind of sources of moving human communication. I mean, most people communicated either by talking to each other person to person or by writing letters to people that you're not in direct contact with. And you put a letter in the mail, and it could take weeks before it gets to the next town over or the next city over. It just depends on how long it takes the mailman to move it there. But with trains and locomotives, they can move messages back and forth much faster, more consistently. So the just kind of awesome power of these locomotives and their awesome speed. They were seen as unbelievably fast, and they could keep going at that speed because they're using steam technology. The fastest that anyone had ever really moved before in human history was really riding a horse at peak speed, as fast as you can get the horse to move. And that could be 30, 40 miles an hour. And the early trains, they could go 30 miles an hour pretty much all the time. So the trains were seen as like this revolution in transportation, and becomes very kind of symbolic of the overall progress of the Industrial Revolution. And one thing to realize, though, is a lot of people, unless you're living in one of these factory towns, a lot of people may have heard of the machines and the Industrial Revolution, but have never really seen it if they still live out on their farms out in the countryside somewhere. So for a lot of people around the world, the first time that they ever really directly, personally experienced the Industrial Revolution is when a railroad is built through their area. And when it's built, you can see that in these images, people go outside to see the trains go through because they're moving so fast and so consistently and pulling so much weight. It's just otherworldly to them. And to build railroads, the railroads have to be, the track has to be very consistent because the train's moving at high speed. You can't have kind of big, quick moves uphill or downhill. So to build a lot of these railroads, the companies and the governments had to literally alter the landscape that the railroad went through. So not only did they have to kind of clear fields to, clear an area for the track to go through, but if there's a mountain in the way, the government comes with dynamite and they blast a hole through the mountain, which is really inconceivable to a lot of people who live in the area of those mountains, and families may have lived there for many generations. And the ground has never changed for these people until the railroad comes through and they blast a hole through the mountain. They just can't believe it. They build these giant bridges to span canyons. So they alter the very landscape that farmers have a very direct emotional, personal experience with the landscape because they're working in the ground all the time. So to have the landscape suddenly transformed in such powerful ways cause a lot of psychological trauma to farmers. So there's a lot of people who feel like the world is changing around them too quickly, and that they can't keep up, and that the traditional ways of life are disappearing. And for these farming societies who have had these traditional ways of life for eons, it's hard for them to adapt. And a lot of farmers and other people around the world look at the Industrial Revolution and industrialization as really destroying the normal, predictable life of farming and peasants and all these kinds of things. So I like these two images because on the left you see kind of the idealistic family cottage on a farm, which is very idealistic because it looks pretty nice. It looks like it's like 2 stories and it's got a nice little fence and a thatched roof and an outbuilding and all that. Most peasant farmers didn't live in anything that nice. They live in a 1-story basic shack, basically. That was barely enough to keep the cold out in the wintertime. So that's a really nice view of peasant farming, but it's useful for this exercise. So that's kind of what a lot of peasants were used to, living on farms for thousands of years. And suddenly, when the railroad and the cities start to grow, a lot of those peasant farmers, especially the young generation, leave the farms and they move to cities to take these industrial jobs working in factories. And they end up in a setting that you see on the right side, surrounded by brick and mortar buildings, maybe steel buildings later on, surrounded by train tracks and noise, and kind of choking on polluted air and water. So it's a very different lifestyle in the cities. And these industrial jobs that they move in to take are dirty. You're working in coal-fired factories for the most part in the 1800s. They're very dangerous because these machines are getting extremely powerful and they move very fast. And if you're not watching out carefully and your hand or something or your sleeve gets caught in the machine, it'll just rip your arm off. And you have to remember, back then there's no workers' compensation, there's no unemployment benefits. So if you get injured in a factory and you get fired because you can't work in the factory anymore, there's no what we today call social safety net to help people that have been injured. So if you're not making money at a job anymore, you have a pretty high likelihood of starving to death. And these jobs really paid very little. There was no minimum wage laws back then, so companies were permitted to pay their workers whatever they thought they could get away with. And with so many people flooding into these industrialized cities, you'd be kind of lucky to even have a job in a factory. There are plenty of people out in the street that were begging for money so they could eat and dream of getting a job in one of these factories so that they can somehow provide for themselves. So a lot of workers are angry about the low pay, but they don't dare complain about it because they get fired. And if you get fired, you're immediately replaced and you're out on the street begging for food. So the industrial setting for the workforce was pretty bleak. And one major group that becomes known as the Luddites, that largely start off in Britain, are so angry about this factory work lifestyle, and so angry that industrialization is destroying the kind of peasant normal life that farmers have inherited for thousands of years. They see it as a full-scale social revolution, basically. So the Luddites become basically a anti-industrial or counter-industrial movement, and they join together and they hold secret meetings very often. And that's largely because in the middle of the night they'll try to break into factories and destroy the machines, and maybe even set the factory on fire, because they're trying to stop the Industrial Revolution and put the working experience back to where it used to be, basically on the farms. So the Luddites hated that industrialization was, in their view, destroying the traditional peasant life and getting rid of traditional morality and norms and all these kinds of things. And going into the next slide, by the late 1800s, an industrial city was itself very bleak. I mean, this is what London looks like by 1870. It's crowded, it's dirty, it's kind of urbanization out of control. There's a lot of poverty. There's unemployed people virtually everywhere, begging for food, stealing. So there's a lot of crime. There's a lot of theft. There's a lot of alcoholism and prostitution and violence. And with this many people, many of them unemployed and desperate, packed together in such a small area, there's a lot of disease. So the water supply isn't very good. The food supply is possibly contaminated. It's a really pretty miserable life. And again, it's an industrialized city, so some days you might not be able to see the sun because there's so much pollution in the air. So it's a pretty desperate circumstance for a lot of people. And those living that kind of lifestyle in the cities really motivates a lot of what we today see as Victorianism, or the so-called cult of domesticity, where a lot of kind of moralistic types of people and religious types of people really hate industrialization, but they realize that just smashing the machines isn't going to stop it, because the inventors are always going to invent new machines as long as they see a profit in it for themselves. So a lot of these social groups start trying to figure out how are we going to teach people to survive in these cities. And they basically hit on the idea that the male workforce, largely that kind of runs the companies and works in the factories, that they are so overwhelmed with work and trying to survive that their only enjoyment is to take what money they have and go to the bar on the weekend and do some crazy things. So they start defining women as the center of morality and purity and ethics, and that you start getting this image that a woman's job is to stay home and raise children and teach the children how to avoid the crime and problems of the city, how to live in a city without being victimized, basically, without being kidnapped, without being raped, without being stolen from or murdered or any of these other horrible things that tend to happen in these industrial cities. So we still obviously see a lot of vestiges of that cult of domesticity, or the moral responsibility of women, or the purity of women, or something like that, the purity of the housewife, in our own society still today. So going on to the so-called Second Industrial Revolution, that really gets going after about the 1860s or so. The Second Industrial Revolution is really based in scientific invention and scientific discovery, and largely kind of chemicals, really. So sciences and invention had always been kind of a driving focus of the Industrial Revolution, kind of got it going and developed a lot of its advances fairly early on. But that really kicks into high gear in the late 1800s, or a higher gear at least, as scientists start trying to do research to figure out how can they solve a lot of these industrial problems, like pollution, or the food supply being contaminated, or something like that. So they'll often study kind of germ theory, they'll study chemistry, they'll study immunology, they'll study how diseases get transferred, and how to sterilize food and water or even milk to make it healthy to consume. So you get a lot of these different kind of sciences. And a lot of them are doing kind of chemical-based research to figure out how to do that kind of sterilization or how to solve these pollution problems. And amongst that chemical research, a new, probably biggest invention in the later Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s is the invention of steel. So it is first kind of created in the 1850s in England, in Britain. And steel is important because, under the second point here, steel is both stronger but also lighter. Metal used, iron. Iron is strong and it can withstand a lot of pressure and heat, but it's also very heavy. So iron is not as useful as steel. Steel is lighter than iron, but it's also stronger. That means you need less steel to get more power, more resistant power than iron. And that allows for all kinds of things to occur, and largely leads to what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution we've talked about before. The material is iron. That's the normal metal that they use up until the 1850s, and the energy they used to power the machines that are made out of iron was at first water and then the steam powered engines. But with the Second Industrial Revolution, steel replaces iron as the general material, and because steel can take so much more pressure, more energy, the inventors of new machines will start to harness electricity and gasoline, which is even more powerful than steam and water as an energy source. So the late 1800s is where you see the start of being able to harness electricity and use it as a energy source to power machines just like we have today. But steel also allowed for a lot of other big things. And one of the first people to realize this fairly quickly in the 1860s was a U.S. businessman named Andrew Carnegie. And he took a lot of his life savings. He was already fairly wealthy by the time he did this. He was retired. He had business investments. He realized what steel could do, and that the U.S. government and other governments would get into buying steel a whole lot because they want to build railroads out of steel. They want to build bridges and buildings and all kinds of things out of steel, because steel will allow you to build bigger stuff that's more reliable. So he took a bunch of his life savings and bought up a steel mill, and when that was profitable, he started buying up other steel mills, basically. And eventually, by the 1890s, when he sold this business, it would make him the richest man in the world. So he became known as a steel baron, which is a word that gets kind of thrown around to describe how the monopolists of a certain industry act. So one of the first big government construction projects to use steel almost completely was the Brooklyn Bridge. And the Brooklyn Bridge basically connects Brooklyn to Manhattan. And the problem with Manhattan is there's a lot of businesses in Manhattan, but a lot of the workforce lives on other islands, other pieces of land away from Manhattan. They need to cross these giant rivers or pieces of the ocean, basically, to get into Manhattan to go to work. And there were several attempts at building a bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan before steel, but they all failed because the expanse of the bridge, the length of the bridge was just too long for any other type of building material to last. I mean, the other attempts basically collapsed. So they tried it with steel, and it worked. And the Brooklyn Bridge is still around today with a steel frame. because steel is both lighter and stronger. And from there, steel frames will become the basic skeleton of new huge buildings that were astronomically larger than any buildings that humans had ever seen before. So before steel starts being used as a frame for buildings, iron or even just brick was the basis, the kind of skeleton of a building. And so a building could only be 3, 4, maybe 5 stories, something like that. Really well-designed buildings could get much bigger than that, but not a whole lot bigger, maybe 10 stories or so. But once you get steel being used as the skeleton of a building, they start getting much, much bigger. So the big cities will start building these, what they call skyscrapers, these very large buildings that might go up 50, 60 stories. Because they can do that because they use steel skeletons. And you see the industrial landscape just start to go up and up and up and up in the late 1800s and continuing into the early 1900s. And it's not just in the United States. It starts being built up in all of the major industrial cities, basically, because their populations are booming. The cities don't have more land to really build on, so instead of building outward on land, they start building upward into the sky. And by the early 1900s, look at the background, this is what the industrial landscape looks like. Some of the buildings start getting so tall that when you're up in them, you can't even hardly see the street anymore. So this is a fun picture of a construction crew on a steel frame building, basically eating their lunch on their lunch break. And they were so high up in the air, they didn't have time on their lunch break to go all the way down to the ground to eat, so they brought their lunch up with them when they went to work in the morning, and they just ate lunch up there to save time. So for anyone who's afraid of heights, it's probably not a job that you want to do so much. But these steel companies and other types of companies keep growing and growing. And they eventually get a problem in the late 1800s in many different industrial economies in different countries, where a company like Carnegie's Steel was so profitable that they were able to buy up their competition. Or they would lower their price to the point where because they had so many steel mills, they can lower their price in one region. So anyone looking to buy a bunch of steel to build a building or something would go to that company to save money, and so they buy the cheaper steel, the lower price steel, and in that way Carnegie or whoever could basically run their competitors out of business, push them into bankruptcy. Another way, which is the way that Rockefeller, the guy in the picture on the right, in the top right, he ran an oil company, and his idea to, quote, monopolize the oil industry was to just pay off the competition. He had so much money that he just went out and bought off other oil company owners, just bought the company from them. So those are two different kind of methods toward monopolization. But a monopoly is when you have really just one company dominating an entire industry. Like Carnegie came to basically run the steel industry in the United States. His company was that powerful. And any new steel company that would try to build a new steel mill and try to compete with them, he would either lower his prices to drive them into bankruptcy, or he'd just buy them up, the way Rockefeller did. So single companies grow to monopolize entire industries, not just oil or steel, but many different industrial markets. And a lot of these kind of owners of these monopolistic companies become labeled robber barons in the popular society. They're barons of their industry, and once they get a monopoly, they're in it for profit. So once there's no other companies that you can buy from, they start upping their price. So they basically start price gouging. So if you need to buy steel to build a bridge, and there's only really one steel company in the area, they're going to charge you a lot of money for that steel because they're looking to maximize their profit. And what are you going to do? there's no other company you can buy from, so it's either you're going to either build this bridge or you're not. So that's what monopolization means. And there's also an interesting development in this kind of late 1800s industrialization. Some of these companies get so large and complex. The owners, like Carnegie and Rockefeller, they own the company. They're like maybe the CEO or the president of the company, but they don't have the time or energy to make all the decisions themselves about how to run a far-flung company that has operations in many states or even many countries. So what they have to do is hire another level of workers, basically a bureaucracy of office workers, to run the far-flung company, to run its local offices in many different cities or even many different countries, and run it for as best profit as they can possibly get. So you eventually get this so-called middle class of what become known as white-collar workers, because they're sitting around in suits and ties. They're not in the factory making the steel or mining the oil or anything like that. So these white-collar workers are basically, they read what we would today call spreadsheets. They have charts of numbers of cost and profits and all kinds of things and working hours and how many workers we're going to need in this place. And they review all these studies and they try to come up with the best ideas possible how to run the company as efficiently as possible to make as much money as possible. So there's a whole kind of mid-level of corporate bureaucrats that start to grow by the late 1800s, early 1900s. And one thing to remember is that these mid-level bureaucrats are almost totally college educated. So most of them, it's not like they start off working in the factory and they get promoted up into the middle ranks of the bureaucracy. No, instead, these are usually children of somewhat wealthy parents who can afford to send their kids to school and then to college, and they get a college degree, and then they go work for one of these companies because having a college degree shows that you know how to read and write, and you can do basic math, and you can do all these things. So you have a different skill set than the average workers in the factory that they're overseeing, which of course angers the factory workers to no end, because these office workers become their bosses, their supervisors. And just like today, an average worker who looks at their boss and says, my boss doesn't even know how to do my job, but they're telling me what to do all the time and ordering me around, generates a lot of anger and oftentimes resistance. So by the 1900s, there's this whole kind of corporate bureaucrat, white-collar employee middle class that's growing in the industrialized societies. So those are just a few kind of terms for those kinds of office workers: bureaucrats, middle class, white-collar workers. We'd probably today call them mostly office workers. And we still see that going on today. I imagine a lot of students in this class are taking this class because they want to get out of the jobs that they're doing now, working on a sales floor or working in a factory or a warehouse or something like that. And they're trying to get a college degree so that they can either move up in their company or get a much nicer office job in an air-conditioned place so they don't have to work in a factory or a warehouse anymore. I know that's certainly why I went to college, because I did work in warehouses when I was a college student and it wasn't none too fun for me. And my job is much easier now. I sit in an air-conditioned room and give lectures, and I'm basically a glorified office worker, reading reports and giving grades. So a lot of our experience today has its roots in the late 1800s industrialization. And another kind of big thing that starts to happen is that we've talked before about how there's no minimum wage laws to pay factory workers very much. There's no worker compensation in case they get injured. There's no social security in case they get injured or they want to retire. So most of these factory workers pretty much work in a factory from age 5 or 6, whenever they can help out a little bit, often until the day they die, whether that's by being killed in a factory accident, or if they live to old age, they're usually doing something in that factory to make a wage for themselves so they can still eat, even if that's just kind of sweeping up the floor. So there's no social security retirement plan. There's none of that stuff. It just didn't exist back then. So one of the big reasons it didn't exist is that a lot of these big, very wealthy and powerful companies basically bribed politicians and governments to make sure that those systems were never passed into law. And that's what this cartoon is showing, that these so-called trusts, these monopolists, that if you vote for a certain minimum wage law that I don't want to see created, then I'll stop giving you money to run your campaigns and I'll give it to one of your competitors and just knock you out of office. So there's a lot of corporate control over politics and laws and policy making. And you see cartoons like this showing that the trusts are basically watching over the legislature all the time, watching what laws get passed and who says what in the debates. So a lot of these trusts and these corporations are seen as kind of unchecked political power. They use their vast profits, their money, in order to bribe the political system, in order to perpetuate what's going on so they can get richer and richer. Political scientists today call it the investment theory of politics. That big rich companies take a slice of their profit, 5%, 10% or something like that, and they really just invest it in political campaigns to make sure that the people and the ideas that they want get into government so that they can continue making more profit the next year, and they just keep doing it year after year to stop any kind of progress to create a minimum wage or anything like that. So those are some of the major problems with industrialization. And there's going to be a major system of criticism about industrialization. And there's several different philosophers that, and economists and whatnot in the 1800s that start speaking out against it and pointing out problems with industrialization. But we'll skip to the biggest one, which is Karl Marx. All right, so Marx is a philosopher. He was a philosophy major in college, got his bachelor's degree, decided to keep going on studying philosophy and starting to kind of write and publish things, and eventually got a PhD in philosophy. So he hated the industrial system. He saw it as basically evil, and he refused to work in it himself. So he would have been, a university professor or something like that, professor of philosophy, if he hadn't started publishing a lot of this stuff that we're going to go through. So some of his biggest statements, he wrote several very long books with a lot of kind of accusations against what people are calling capitalism. So his biggest accusations are really that feudalism was ended in Europe. The kind of feudal relationships between lord who owns all the farmland in an area and the peasant farmers who work the fields for the lord and grow all the food. That's a pretty tyrannical type system, and most peasants kind of hated it. It was called the feudal system or feudalism, and Marx basically said that was all destroyed really in the previous few hundred years up into the 1700s or so. But he says the problem is that feudalism may be gone and the peasant farmers may be much freer now, but the Industrial Revolution has instead created what he called a wage slavery system for the factory workers. They work all their lives, week after week in a factory, and they're paid so little that they can never afford to save money to escape the system. He basically says it's a new system of slavery where there's no more feudal lords, but there are factory owners and managers, and they take all the profit and they oppress the workforce. So he says it's a new form of feudalism, basically. And he says that the companies that get rich off of this industrial system accumulate capital. They accumulate more and more money. And they use that money to buy or create more factories or buy out the competition and try to establish monopolies. So his theory is that under industrial capitalism, the ownership of factories gets more and more powerful and wealthy over time. And they start trying to buy each other out and getting into the price war and stuff like that. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So his first kind of big public statements largely come out of a book called the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And he gives some pretty basic definitions of different types of workers, different types of people in society. First one is what he calls the bourgeoisie. And he defines them as the owners of the factories and the machines, basically what we call the investor class. The people who don't work in factories, but instead they were the original investors that built the factories and are making so much profit that they have extra money to invest in other businesses. So they don't really spend their time even in a factory much at all. They own the factory, which Marx calls the means of production, because the factory is what makes the goods that people depend on a day-to-day basis. So he describes the bourgeoisie as people who basically sit behind a desk. They have their ledgers and their investments, and they're really kind of like bankers and investors. They move their money around to the places and investments that they think will make them the most money in the future. And he says the bourgeoisie lead a pretty nice life. They basically work in their home office, or they work at a bank, and they work a few hours a day deciding where to put their money, and they spend the rest of the day, like in this picture, they go to parks, they go to parties, they really enjoy life and they enjoy their wealth. And the other side of the workforce for Marx is what he calls the proletariat. And these are the industrial workers who are pretty much spending 12, 14 hours a day in a factory, 6 days a week. Sometimes they get Sundays off to go to church. The proletariat are the ones that work not just 8 hours a day in a factory, but often 12, 14, even 16-hour shifts. So they are worked to exhaustion, to the point where they go home, they maybe get some food, and they pass out for a few hours until they have to wake up and go to another shift. So they work long hours, usually 6 days a week, and they are paid very, very low wages, to the point where they can never save money to escape this or even look for another job. So Marx calls this wage slavery. You're just paid so little that you never have an opportunity to escape. And he says the proletariat never really do escape. They're stuck in the factory system. They're uneducated. They don't have time to go to college. They don't have time to go to school. And there's not many public universities, or there's no community colleges out there that exist at the time to even offer the opportunity for someone who doesn't have a lot of money to go to school to get an education to escape this kind of work. So he literally calls this wage slavery. So he's kind of defines those two different groups in industrial society. And in the Communist Manifesto, he pretty clearly calls for what he says is violence against the bourgeoisie. He wants the workforce to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. And he says that this violence should not be directed against them personally. You don't want to rise up and kill off the bankers and investors and whatnot, because that's not really going to work. Because if you kill the bankers, another group of bankers are just going to come in and gain control over the investments, and you're going to be in the same problem. So Marx wants instead violence against their property. And what he means by that is to say that he wants the workforce to take control over the means of production from the investor class and pretty much run it themselves on some level. So this gets into his whole theory of how capitalism works. He says that capitalism is based on the exploitation of the proletariat workforce. That an investor can only make profit if they are exploiting the workers that work for them. So he basically says that if you're a factory worker, you go into the factory and you work your 12, 16-hour shift, whatever, you produce value for the company. You make the things that the company sells. And when the company sells that thing and gets profit, the problem is that they don't share that profit with the workers very much. They pay the workers as little as they can possibly get away with, which is exploitation. It's basically the investor class that owns and operates the factories and the bureaucrats that run the thing. They are basically stealing value from the workers who actually put in the blood, sweat, and tears into the labor that makes the goods that go for sale and make all the money. So the workers do all the work in the factory, but the owners exploit them by stealing their value. And that's where you get sayings like, all wealth is the result of crime. And the greater the wealth, the greater the crime. Because if you're really rich, it means that you stole value from a lot of different people. And Marx pointed that out pretty clearly in the book. And Marx says that if the workers are so heavily oppressed and exploited, that the natural response from them is to start talking to each other about how to solve this problem, which, eventually Marx predicts will lead to them to organize, and possibly organize for revolution against the whole system. But at the very least, organize to form some kind of worker unions to try to get higher wages or something, some kind of improvement in their conditions. So Marx says that capitalism is based on exploitation. He says that's the thesis, that's the idea of capitalism. But the natural response is for workers to get together and organize a resistance. So he calls that the antithesis, the antithesis of capitalism. And that's where he says things like capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. That just the way capitalism exists and operates will push the workforce to undo capitalism at some point. So what does he want this giant revolution to do? He basically says that an anti-capitalist revolution should also be a political revolution. So it should overthrow the governments that are allowing all this exploitation to happen in the first place. And he says if the proletarians can do that, what they really should try to go for is democracy. That's the political solution, because the workforce is the mass majority of the society. So if you have a democracy and the workers vote in their own interest, they're going to vote for leaders that will serve the workforce, basically, and do what the workers want. So Marx thinks that democracy is the solution, the political solution to all this. And, the workforce, they just have to get a democracy and figure out what's in their own interest to support when election day rolls around and go out and vote for it. So Marx says that this kind of revolution is against kings, against dictators, and pro-democracy. And he says that this is probably not going to succeed if it happens in just one country first and then slowly starts to spread to other countries, because capitalists, the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, will unify to kill it if it happens in just one place and one time. So that's why he says at the end of the book, workers of all lands unite, all at the same time, because they can't stop all revolutions in all places at the same time. It's just too big for them. We'll overwhelm them as a workforce. So that's the Communist Manifesto in just a few minutes. It's longer than that and a little more complex than that, but that's the gist of it. He wrote another book, but much longer, in 1867, called Capital, where he kind of expands on these original arguments and gives more evidence and more theory and things like that. He starts off with the idea that, again, capitalism just replaced feudalism. It's another source of tyranny and exploitation for the workforce. And he expands on this idea of capitalism basically destroying itself over time. In, I think it's chapter 32, it's a very famous chapter, it's something called like On the Accumulation of Capital. He gives a prediction for how this kind of workforce revolution is likely to unfold. He basically says that capitalists, the investors, will basically destroy each other because they're so greedy. They're so obsessed with survival. So he says if you look at any single industry, for instance, like the grocery store business, you have several companies out there, some of them very large. So you'll have like a Stater Brothers and a Ralph's and an Albertsons, and 10 different companies or so. And that's where the general population goes to get their groceries. They choose one or other of these companies to go to. How do you, as a consumer, a person who wants to buy groceries, decide which place to go to? Usually, you go to the one that's cheapest because you want to save money. So what do capitalists do in order to attract buyers? They lower their prices as much as they possibly can because they want to attract enough customers to make money and deny other companies those customers. So they get into basically price warfare against each other. So say Stater Brothers lowers their prices a little bit and they get a bunch of business. Albertsons notices that and they lower their prices. That is generally seen as a good thing for the workforce because they're getting resources at lower prices. But what eventually happens is, according to Marx, that some of those companies are going to go out of business because they can't lower their prices anymore. The ones that are not efficient enough will start losing profit, losing so many customers that they just shut down. And Marx will he predicts that over time, that price warfare amongst the investors, amongst the capitalists, will really create a monopoly where one company is left selling all the groceries in society. So the big question that he talks about in this chapter is, all right, so say Stater Brothers is the last one standing. They become the monopolist. Well, what happens to all the investors and the bureaucrats and the owners, the middle class and the bourgeoisie, who used to work for Albertsons, or who used to work for Ralph's, or any of the other chains that have gone out of business? What do they do to survive if they haven't saved their money and now they need to get a job in order to eat? Well, they might see themselves as experts in the grocery business, so it's not like they're going to go into the gas station business or something like that. They don't know anything about that business. They're experts in groceries, so what do? They go work for the last company standing, which means that they become part of the proletariat. They become wage slaves. And Marx says that over time, his prediction is that the proletariat as a proportion of society will grow and grow and grow because all the investors who lost out joined the proletariat. And he says that at some point, when you have 98, 99% of all the people in society are proletariat, and they're looking around, he says one day they're going to walk out of their houses and they're going to look around and they see nothing but wage slavery and misery surrounding them. And there's so few owners left that he says that the revolution becomes inevitable. It becomes unavoidable. All the people have to do is walk out of their homes and look at each other and look at what they're living in and see that they're so disconnected from any source of wealth. And all they have to do is see what he calls elementary class consciousness. Once they realize they're all part of the oppressed class, then they will rise up in revolution. And that's his prediction. So he says it's pretty much unavoidable. He says this is just basic economics. It's science. He wants the people to rise up and take away the means of production from the owners. He wants them to go take the machines and the factories away from the investor class that basically sit in their homes or their banks or whatever. And he uses a big fancy word called expropriation, which means taking away. It's a fancy word for that. That's one problem with Marx. He uses these gigantic words that most people don't even understand. And he uses big terms like the expropriation of the expropriators, which means a fairly simple thing. He wants the people, the workers, to rise up and take back the means of production from the bourgeoisie, who he said had stolen it from the peasants in the first place throughout the 1800s. But he runs into a problem in his theory. What are they going to do once they take the means of production, the private property from the owners. One big problem he recognized is that if the workers take it from the owners and then just give it to a new group of owners, you don't really solve the problem. You just make somebody else rich, and the same oppression will probably continue. So instead, he wants what he calls the communist revolution. He says that the workers should take the factories and not give it to another group of private owners, but instead give it to the public, so that the government will run the factories. And government, politicians, will make decisions about what wages to pay, how many shoes this certain factory should produce per day, per week, per month. That the government should own and operate the means of production, because the government will do so for the benefit of all people equally. That's his theory. And he also says you have to combine this with democracy. Because if you live under a king, under a dictator, you give the factories to the government, you just create another oppressive class. So you need a democracy where the workforce is the majority, and if they vote in their own interest, they will vote for politicians that will run the factories for the interest of everybody. Is what he says is the magical combination. Basically, a communist economy where the government runs the factory system, the means of production, and a political democracy where the general population chooses who runs the government. So he says that in the end this is all historically inevitable. He says this is economic science, so there's no way out of it. It's proven, it's going to happen at some point, and he wants to help it along. But this is also why capitalists and investors and bankers hate Karl Marx so much, and hate his ideas, and define him as the root cause of evil and all these kinds of things in modern human society, because they're trying to scare people away from reading these ideas, especially the workforce. They do not want factory workers reading this stuff, or even thinking about it on any level, because it scares the ownership class, it scares the investors. They're scared of revolution. So that kind of dichotomy, those kinds of political ideas will start spreading around the world after Marx starts publishing this stuff, 1840s to the 1860s. And you'll start getting different communist groups, political groups that will start political parties, the communist parties and socialist parties and all kinds of things throughout Europe and the United States. And eventually, when industrialization comes to Latin America, Latin American political parties will start talking about these things too. So we'll see a lot of long-term effects of these ideas throughout the whole rest of the course, and even up until today. And we're going to keep returning to the idea of communist revolution and communist parties throughout the rest of the course. So we'll stop here for today, and we'll kind of move forward in the next section of the class about how industrialization and communist and capitalist ideas have big impacts on Latin American history.